few different issues, and I've got quite a few screenshots, and we will be making these slides available after the seminar. I think, Kayleen, I'll send an updated version. But just to begin with, I've been looking at this industry for quite a long time now, over a decade, and it was the subject of my book, Buying Yourself on the Internet, which was originally published in 2019, but the paperback came out last year, and it's also available in full through JSTOR, which has been really helpful for making it more accessible. And if you're interested in my related work, I've just listed a couple of other articles and chapters there that you might find useful. The second one also deals with wearable tech, and I'm hoping to do more work on that in the future. But because I get way too interested in things when I do get interested, I've actually acquired quite a lot of data around this industry through the course of my research. And in 2018, I released a version of my data set because I believe in open access. So if you're interested in this industry and you haven't really looked at it before, you might find downloading my data quite useful. I'm hoping to release an updated version. These are really just tables, though, of all the companies that I could find with English language websites that offered some form of DNA testing online. And so it will say where the company is located and the types of tests that they offer. Now, although I've been working on this for a while, I actually am continuing to work on this as well as other issues in technology law. And I have 2 funded projects at the moment, and I'm hoping to be able to share findings from those with you all over the next year as well. The first of these is a public survey project, and this was actually funded by the University of Waikato and Genomics Aotearoa, and it's joint work with Dr. Jan Charbonneau, who's based at the University of Tasmania. Now, we actually got the funding a little while ago, but because of COVID and all the disruption caused by it, we actually ran this survey this year. So we're in the process of going through our data, and we'll be disseminating results over the next year. And this is a public survey project that actually involved 1,000 Australians and 1,000 New Zealanders. It's an online panel survey asking questions about privacy perceptions in the context of direct-to-consumer DNA testing. And I have a second project as well. Oh, and I should just mention too that we were very lucky to be able to include a quota of respondents who were Indigenous peoples in both the Australian and the New Zealand samples. So we have 20% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and 20% Maori respondents in the survey. So we're really hoping to disseminate the work quite widely, and we're hoping it will be useful to the broader community. The second project that I'm continuing to work on, which will run into next year, is a project with Professor Samuel Betcher at the Victoria University of Wellington, and this is funded by the Boren Foundation. And here we're actually exploring risks in the context of this industry. And part of our funding is going towards organising the Australasian Consumer Law Roundtable, which will be held in Wellington this year. And some of you, I hope, may be coming to that. I know Kayleen and I actually met for the first time in person in Melbourne at a previous Consumer Law Roundtable, so I'm really looking forward to that. But I just wanted to mention those 2 things because there will be other work that I can share in the next year going forward. So to begin with, I just wanted to see, and I'm happy to take questions towards the end, but if you post anything in the chat while I'm talking that I can address, if Kayleen or Amy alerts me, I will try and address it as I go along. But I wanted to start by just mentioning a few of the prominent...
Angelka, I'll just jump in there to let you know that I've actually also I'd enabled the Q&A function in Teams, which is a new one.
Okay.
And so if people could do it via there rather than via chat, that would be helpful. But if you can't find it, just put it in the chat. I'll look at both, but it's just I'll look at Q&A first.
Yes, thank you, Kayleen. And if you can just alert me that if there is a question, because for some reason I actually can't see the Q&A or the chat on my screen, but I'll do my best to answer everything. But I wanted to begin by just mentioning a few of the prominent companies that some of you may have heard of. Bearing in mind that I'm aware today that a number of you may have actually tested with a direct-to-consumer testing company, or had a family member or a friend test with one of them. Whereas when I gave similar talks, if we say even 5 years ago, that was far less likely. It's really become much more popular, really since about 2016. So some of you may have heard of 23andMe, which is one of the real market leaders, one of the original companies in this space. And that was co-founded by Anne Wojcicki, who used to be married to Sergey Brin, who's the co-founder of Google. And Google has invested heavily in 23andMe. And as a prime example of the way this industry is prone to change and partnerships and mergers, 23andMe has recently been acquired by Virgin, and it's entered into at least 15 partnerships prior to that with pharmaceutical companies. So there's a lot of data sharing going on in this space, and I'm hoping that some of what you take away from this talk today is that there are really significant privacy risks in this context, and we do need more awareness around that. Another company that you may have heard of is Ancestry. Now, Ancestry started life as a genealogy website. It didn't used to have any sort of connection with DNA testing at all, but it then opened a DNA testing branch, and it's also been acquired by another entity in the last 2 years. And then Family Tree DNA, you may be aware of. It had some interesting press coverage in the last few years because of its collaboration with the FBI. But Family Tree DNA is actually a company that's based in Texas, and it has acquired a number of smaller ancestry testing companies. So it's potentially got quite a large database. I would suggest that Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, and Ancestry, they all have databases of consumers' data that have several million people in them now. It took a very significant amount of time, though, before 23andMe or any of these entities actually reached the million consumer mark initially, though. And the other company I just wanted to mention that you might be aware of is Decode Genetics. And Decode started life as the company that got the contract to map the genome of the Icelandic population, which was quite controversial at the time because the Icelandic population is quite closely related, and this was done on an automatic opt-in basis. And that entity has had several lives. It did become a direct consumer testing company at one point as well. And so I just wanted to share a few prominent examples. But what I'm going to do today is actually share some screenshots of other entities as well, just to give you some idea of the types of things that are going on in this space. So the thing I always like to stress in this context is that while you might be aware of some prominent companies like 23andMe or Ancestry, you might have heard of MyHeritage as well, or Living DNA, these companies are generally at what I would suggest is the better end of a spectrum of services. It's a very diverse industry. Most companies don't restrict themselves to offering just one type of testing, and many might begin for instance, doing ancestry testing and then move into health testing. So most companies will offer several different types of tests, but while the more prominent companies have been the subject of much more academic and public scrutiny, we have companies at the other end of the spectrum which have really had far less attention, and we don't really know exactly what they're doing. So just to be clear, health testing and ancestry testing is probably what you're most familiar with. Health testing actually covers quite a broad range of different tests. These range from testing for your carrier status, whether you're likely to pass on a particular condition to your children, to disease risk estimates, pharmacogenetics, which looks at the connection between your DNA and your responsiveness to particular drugs, and also nutrigenetics, which is very much connected with diet and nutrition. I would like to stress that many of the health tests on the market don't have clinical utility at the moment. They're not widely used in a clinical setting, and the usefulness of the information will be inherently limited to the individual tested, because for the most part, companies are not performing a whole genome or a whole exome sequence. So this means too that It's quite common for a company to be researching on a particular connection between genetics and a disease, and they might be looking at a different genetic variant for the same disease as another company. So it's possible to actually get contradictory disease risk estimates from different companies. So a person might be told they're at heightened risk of getting a particular type of cancer from one company and told they're at a lower risk of getting the same type of cancer from another company. So it is questionable how useful this is, particularly in terms of what you can actually action from a health perspective. But if you look at some of these websites, and I do recommend playing around with the websites if you are interested in this, or if you're seriously considering having a test, you really might want to look at some of the ways that these are marketed and compare those with what's actually been specified in the online contracts and privacy policies that govern these transactions. So just to explain too, I've conducted a review of 71 contracts from companies that market tests for the purposes of health, and my book drew upon that review, and I looked from a protection standpoint. So you may want to look at that, and I'll get into that a bit more, but I really just want to give you some idea of the nature of this industry and some of the problems today. And I'm very happy to be contacted after this as well. The other thing, the other most common type of testing, and probably the most common type of testing, in fact, is actually ancestry testing. It's important to recognize, though, that these tests are also not standardized. They don't really represent any sort of truth. You can get different ethnicity estimates from different companies, and it's really something it's possible someone might find fun, but I'm also going to go through some of the risks in a few minutes as well. At the other end of the spectrum, though, we have things such as child talent, which is not very well validated or encouraged in a clinical setting. And there's also paternity tests, which are normally offered with a peace of mind or a non-legal option, which doesn't have witnesses and is very open to exploitation. And then there's infidelity tests, which actually encourage people to send in samples belonging to other people without their consent. And then there's also genetic matchmaking and forensics. So it's a very complex industry in the sense that there's lots of different entities moving in and out of the market, partnering with other industries as well, particularly the pharmaceutical industry, but also insurance. And there's a lot of interest from law enforcement in this context. And so why is this important? Why am I talking about this today, and why should we be worried about this as legal academics or other academics or policymakers or people in governance or the public? Why should my family member be worried about doing this? Well, to begin with, we can argue about whether or not genetic information is special, but this industry has made a market for genetic tests as commercial services, and so that means that consumer protection law and actually contract law is enlivened, because generally companies are using their online contracts and privacy policies to govern their relationships with consumers. The other thing here, though, is that we share a lot of our DNA with our family. And as well as that being the case, once we have a genetic test, that will generate digital data, which can serve as a unique identifier for us as individuals. And this is something that won't change over time in a way that would mean that we couldn't link it back to you. So it's potentially, it can be actually stored indefinitely and always have that risk of linking back to you. And because we share so much with our family members, that means that the risk of a data leakage in this context doesn't necessarily decrease over time. It might affect your children or your grandchildren, wider cousins, and your wider family group. And although there used to be quite a lot of interest in the idea of completely anonymizing genetic data sets, there's been a number of studies that have demonstrated that it's quite possible to re-identify people in quite large databases with access to very little information about them. So there is that risk, and although there's some really good things being done in terms of encryption techniques and exploring how we can protect that data and still do research on it, there are a lot of potential privacy risks here that aren't going to go away overnight. There's a lot of future risk here that we can't necessarily predict. And I would encourage you just to think about the ways that information is increasingly being gathered together to make profiles about us, and the ways that genetic information could in the future be used potentially against our interests. So the other thing just to be aware of in this context is that the nature of this industry encourages sharing. So companies generally have family finder features and social networking features that allow people to connect with people to whom they might be related, and you're often encouraged to share information that is potentially quite sensitive and might traditionally have actually been part of medical records. So there's a lot of sharing here. You might find out that you have different biological parents from whom you thought were your biological parents, which can have a really significant impact on people. Companies are often doing research on consumers' data, particularly medical research. And so there are a number of challenges in this space, even where companies are actually trying to do things well. If we think about things such as the right to be forgotten, for instance, it's going to be quite difficult for a company to completely ensure that things have been deleted if you have shared with a wide group. The other thing just to be aware of here is secondary use is a really significant issue in this context. Law enforcement is increasingly interested in this. I've had contact with a number of privacy regulators and also law enforcement and other entities that are interested in how law enforcement might use this to identify suspects and deceased remains. There's a lot of medical research going on in this space. There's been collaborations between the insurance and the pharmaceutical industries, and there's also been use by other entities of these services, such as immigration authorities. In fact, the Canadian Immigration Authority has tried to use some of these services in order to try and identify people's national origins, which is really problematic because that identifying that someone has some heritage from a particular country doesn't necessarily mean at all that they will actually have a right to live there or be from there necessarily. So this is a really dubious use, and I just wanted to highlight that there are these wide ranges of uses. But something that some of you might be more familiar with is the law enforcement use, particularly because of the press coverage around the Golden State Killer case, where GEDmatch, which is a genetic genealogy website which allows you to upload your genetic test results from other companies. Well, this was used in order to find a suspect who's since been convicted in the Golden State Killer case. Now, I would just suggest caution in this context, though, because often DNA is not the only evidence that we need in a particular case, and I'm going to mention another example just to highlight the things that can go wrong. While I'm not saying they got the wrong person in this particular case, we do need to think about balancing rights in this context, making sure people are aware of risks, and just being aware of the scale and proportionality in this context, because in order to find the suspect in that particular case and some other cases, sometimes they've actually had to create family trees which contain up to 10,000 people on them. So it's just something to be aware of, that it isn't a magic bullet, as most of us know as well, and we have to be a little bit cautious about how we treat this. So a sort of funny example to start with of the impacts that this can have on people. So this was an article written a few years back, actually now, almost 10 years ago, by George Doe, which isn't their real name. But George Doe gave their parents genetic tests, I think from 23andMe actually, as Christmas gifts, and subsequently that meant that their father was connected with an unknown son, and that led to the breakdown of their parents' marriage, which was not their intention. Now, this is obviously an example of a really significant impact on a family. Some people actually have quite positive experiences, but it's quite possible for these to actually have quite negative and surprising impacts. So it's just important to be aware of that. And I would suggest that if this is something that you're seriously considering for your own family, I would always recommend talking to your other family members first, and perhaps just checking that there isn't any skeleton in the closet before you unleash this on them. And the other thing is just to be aware of that most of these companies are not guaranteeing accuracy in any way. And so I would still suggest that even if you had a finding through an ancestry test that you had a different biological parent from whom you thought was your biological parent, I would still recommend actually having confirmatory testing in a clinic just to follow that up. And this is the other side of it that most people won't be aware of when they are thinking of having a test like this. DNA is something that is treated very positively in a lot of crime shows. And unfortunately, many of us get much of our understanding about how the police actually use DNA in criminal investigations from television and movies, which is unfortunate, and we need to work on that. But there's also a call to actually have more training in genetics for general practitioners and the medical profession as well. So there's a lot of problems going on here. But generally, it's really important just to understand that if I was physically in the room with you, I could leave traces of myself with you today. At the moment, there's no way I can possibly do that, delivering this virtually, but generally when we're out and about and when we're teaching in a classroom environment, we can leave traces of ourselves quite unconsciously anywhere we go, without knowing it necessarily, and without it having any connection with us committing any sort of criminal activity. And so one of the problems in this space is thinking that DNA evidence is evidence of anything if we don't have other supporting evidence. And if you haven't read about this before, I really recommend starting with this short Wired article, which talks about the case of Lucas Anderson, who'd been charged with the murder of Rabesh Kumra because traces of Lucas's DNA were found on the body of the murder victim's fingernail, or under the murder victim's fingernails. Now, when I talk to students about this, this does seem quite incriminating, and I understand that. But the problem in this case was that there's a lot of problems, but Lucas was actually charged with murder, and he was in jail because he'd confessed, because he was homeless and an alcoholic and prone to blackouts, and he thought that he could have committed it. He hadn't, but because he confessed and he was charged, he was in this unfortunate situation. And he was really lucky that his lawyers looked into his case, and they found that on the night in question, he was so drunk that he became unconscious, and he was picked up off the streets and taken to hospital that night, and he was in hospital all night. And somehow the same paramedics who actually took him to hospital that night, later that night attended the crime scene, and they must have transferred his DNA probably on those through those oximeters, sorry, I'm a bit tired, or some other thing that you put on someone's hands. But I do just like to highlight this example of the really negative impacts that giving too much weight to just one form of evidence can have in this context. And the other thing just to bear in mind when we think about unique identifiers and genetic information being a unique identifier for us is that it's really important just to recognize that it's not something that we can change like our bank password. And a good example and a good comparison is actually a social security number in the US, which is really difficult to change. And people who were victims of the Equifax data breach actually may have people potentially taking out credit cards in their names for the rest of their lives because it's so difficult to change your social security number. And with some other data breaches that we've seen in New Zealand and Australia more recently, there's the potential for some of these things to actually happen here as well. So it's just important to bear in mind. And now what I wanted to do in the time that remains is I'm going to show you some screenshots, and I'm also going to just mention a few issues around contracting in this context. So to begin with, just to highlight the types of language that are generally, or that is genuinely used on these websites is very positive. You'll encounter far more positive messaging about the benefits of testing rather than any information about limitations. So if you look at the screenshot, which I actually took today because I thought I'd just update some of these and have really, really current ones. There's a range of current and slightly older ones in these slides. But you'll see it says that there's an 80% of people who have a test with them receive a report with a meaningful genetic variant. Now, what does that mean for most of us? That might mean something very limited in terms of our healthcare and outlook. And it's a very sort of vague message, but there's also been much more prominent messaging on the website in the past, which suggested that having a test would definitely be useful in your treatment decisions. And one of the other things just to bear in mind is that the cost of tests has really dropped here, but companies are not generally making a profit from the sale of tests. They're making a profit from the partnerships they can enter into and the mergers they can do to use large samples of consumer data in ongoing research. And so it's very common for companies actually to then offer holiday discounts. This is an example from one from last year. And you'll see some other examples of the language here that I just wanted to highlight. So Origin is another prominent company in the space. They've entered into a very lucrative partnership with a Chinese insurance company whereby they were going to provide tests to 200 million policyholders in China. And they also offer their tests, which a number of other companies are now doing through Amazon as well. But just to highlight here how cheap these are getting, you'll see that some of these are $12.99 or $18. I would really suggest that the beauty test on the far right of this slide is quite concerning. It's really just meant to tell you things about skin and health, but I wouldn't generally encourage you to take some of these types of tests really. And if you have a serious medical concern, my advice would always be to actually consult a physician and undergo testing in a clinical setting. This is another example from EasyDNA. This is from their Australian website. EasyDNA is quite a prominent company. They have lots of different domain names in different countries, and they offer quite a wide variety of tests. And they're quite a good example of a less prominent direct-to-consumer testing company that offers a very wide variety of tests. So although it may look sort of potentially not harmless, shall we say, on the surface of the website, you'll see that they'll offer infidelity and peace of mind paternity testing further along the site. The other thing I wanted just to mention here is that even where health tests might be useful, it's been found that it's generally going to be advisable for a person to have follow-up genetic testing in a clinic to confirm any findings that they received from a direct consumer testing company. And this was a study done a couple of years back. If anyone's interested, I can actually refer you to the actual conference paper. But here they looked at 23andMe's BRCA testing, which, as some of you may know, is mostly associated with breast and ovarian cancer. But they found that they actually, the tests that they offered, miss almost 90% of BRCA mutation carriers. and it misses almost 20% of BRCA mutations in those of self-reported Ashkenazi Jewish descent. And so most of the BRCA testing that 23andMe has been doing in the past has been most useful for people of Ashkenazi Jewish descent because they test for a number of the variants most common amongst that population. But basically, for both positive and negative findings, you would still need follow-up testing in a clinic to confirm this. So that's just important to be aware of. I just also wanted to highlight the acquisition by version of 23andMe just so that you're aware of it. And then moving on to Ancestry, which some of you may be aware of, or more aware of, may have had an Ancestry test. It's very common for these to be discounted, for you to be encouraged to buy tests for family members. This was actually a screenshot I took when I lived in Ireland. I'm not really sure what the connection between the Soccer World Cup and wanting to get a DNA test is, but they certainly thought you might be interested. And there's a few other examples, and as the slides will be made available, you can have a look at them afterwards, but I just wanted to give you a range of what's out there. And just also highlight that while the more prominent companies in this space are probably doing something that's to some extent useful, we do need to be cautious about some of the players that we don't really know very much about in this space. There are companies doing quite dubious types of testing. This is a very useful article that CBC in Canada did, where they're investigating a company that had provided First Nations ancestry estimates on more than one dog DNA sample, and we're generally giving 20% First Nations ancestry estimates to people regardless of their ethnicity. And this is a really interesting example because this company also was providing the tests for an organisation that had set itself up in competition with the government recognised First Nations representative organisation in Canada. And so I would really recommend reading this if you're interested in this. It's really important. And then also if you're just interested in how the limitations of testing, particularly when you have mixed ancestry. I have quite mixed ancestry myself. This might be quite a useful starting point for you. And then to end with some of the more dubious things that you will see out here, paternity test examples. This is a real company who's the daddy. They've been around for a while. They are really quite a good example of the way that paternity testing companies tend to operate, and any company offering paternity testing often will actually, well, more than 90% of the companies that I looked at offered a legal option and a peace of mind option, which was normally cheaper. And this is just another example, a very recent one from the company based in Australia, just to give you some comparison. And this is something I always like to mention because it's not something that's had as much attention, but child talent testing is on the rise, particularly in some countries where things can already be very competitive for children anyway. But generally, it's important to be aware that most clinical geneticists would not encourage testing of children for adult onset diseases. So now this encouraging of testing of children for talent, which is not very well validated scientifically, is really quite worrying. You'll see this inborn talent genetic test. It's a good example of the types of things that are out there. But I just like to highlight this screenshot here, which shows really how they're preying on parents and families to some extent, I would suggest. So you'll see that it offers things like big savings, happier parent-child relationship. Basically, in the big savings and effective planning part, they're really suggesting that if you don't think your child is going to be very talented at music or something else, you don't need to bother paying for music lessons. But this is a very negative way and a very genetically deterministic way of viewing people, and it's really problematic and something I would genuinely recommend being very cautious about engaging with. And this is the origin version of that, which is still sold out. It's been sold out most of this year, which is kind of strange and worrying. And you'll see here some of the things that they test for. So enlightenment, fitness, sleep and behavior, and nutrition. All of this is really not particularly useful, particularly when we think about the area of the connection between genetics and whether you're likely to be an elite athlete. There has been some research that's found an association between certain genetic variants and your ability to be a long distance runner or a sprinter, but several elite athletes actually don't have those known variants. So a lot of this is actually not, your genes are often not that determinative of a lot of these behavioral traits. And so it's quite concerning to see these sorts of things being marketed more widely. And this is a real company. I'm starting to wonder if it might finally have closed its doors when I was checking today, but it actually resulted in some significant scientific backlash. You'll see this example of yes or no genomics at the bottom of the slide, which was prompted specifically by soccer genomics. And I'm going to stop talking in a couple of minutes just because I started a bit late, but I just wanted to mention some issues around contracts in this space. So as part of my work, I've looked at the contracts of 71 companies that market tests for health purposes in this context. I've also looked at other companies' contracts over the years and am continuing to do work in this space. In our recent survey that I did with Jan Charbonneau, we've also asked questions about how people engage with privacy policies, so I'm hoping to be able to share some of that. But my findings so far when I've actually looked at these contracts on my own is that generally they're very similar to most online contracts that you encounter online. And it means that often they contain contractual clauses that could be challenged on the grounds of unfairness under Australian law, New Zealand law, the UK and EU, and actually Irish law as well, because I was originally looking at this in the context of UK law, but all of these jurisdictions actually have very similar legislation on unfair terms and contracts. So that's quite problematic. These contracts appear as terms and conditions, terms of service, or terms of use on these websites. They're often linked to other documents. Sometimes, for instance, on 23andMe's website, you might be having to read up to 6 or 7 documents to really understand all of your rights in this context. And so we really do need reform, because people are often treating these documents in the same way that they would treat their iTunes agreement. And so just to highlight a few relevant studies in this context, the Norwegian Consumer Council has done some really great work in this context, and they estimated that the average smartphone contained 250,000 words of app terms and conditions. And that was in 2016, just bearing in mind that that may have actually increased now over the last few years with COVID. And this is a really useful study by Professor Samuel Betcher and another colleague, which looked at the readability of the 500 most popular US website terms and conditions and found that 90% of those were actually written at the level of an academic journal article. Now, I'm an academic. A lot of you listening to me today probably are academics, but even we will struggle with reading some academic journal articles. And even we who are legally trained will have trouble reading some online contracts. So this is really problematic. And I always like to end with some sort of funny examples that are obviously not enforceable, but just highlight the types of things that can be buried within these documents. So just as companies such as 23andMe have included things like indemnity clauses and clauses that allow them to change their terms at any time or from time to time, GameStation's experiment actually inserted this clause whereby, and some of you may be aware of it already, whereby you gave over your immortal soul. And there's a more recent example from Purple Wi-Fi, where they got 22,000 people to agree to 1,000 hours of community service. So really what I'm doing here is just using a couple of funny examples just to highlight that there are problems that we need to try and address in this space. And there's a lot of suggestions I have for reform. I don't think there's one perfect solution. One of the problems is that we do actually have this industry that's been quite poorly regulated to date. It's an international industry, mostly based in America, but selling to consumers all over the world. And even in the law enforcement context, you'll actually find that sometimes law enforcement in Australia and New Zealand may actually be sending samples to private companies in America when they're investigating things. So reform is needed. I think we need regulatory reform. I think we need things like compliance reviews and audits and model contracts and privacy policies. We're also exploring the use of the consumer data right in this context in my other Boren Foundation funded project. And I think we need a lot more consultation with the public and industry in this context, and this better oversight and better practices, better contracts and privacy policies that people can actually understand. So I'm going to stop talking now, but thank you very much. And I'm sorry I can't see any of your faces, but I haven't used Teams quite as much. I've used a lot of Zoom and other platforms, but I just seem to be able to just see my slides and no one else. But I'm very happy to take questions, and thank you very much.
Hey, thanks so much, Andelka. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Kate.
Great. Yeah. So thanks so much to Andelka for coming along. So I would like to invite people to ask questions. We do have a little bit of time for questions. You can, I have set up the Q&A, but if you can't find that, please just ask a question in the chat. Or if you're keen to, do it by audio, you can just put up your hand and I will enable your audio. So if anyone has any questions, please let me know, or otherwise I have a question. No, nobody's
like
putting up.
Might have one in the Q&A, Kayleen.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Amy.
Oh.
And this is from Gahan. Now, can you see it? You can't.
I've opened it so I can see you. I'm not quite sure whether
No, that's all right.
Show conversation. No, I can't see it.
No, that's all right.
You can tell what the question is. That's great.
Gahan makes the point. Firstly, that's an excellent presentation. But your example of Canadian immigration using data to identify applicant ethnicity resonates with news today in New Zealand that government agencies have been using controversial cobwebs platform which snoops on people's social media profiles, including their religious and sexual affiliation. The New Zealand government has defended use of the platform. What do you see as legitimate as opposed to illegitimate use of genetic data?
I think we need a lot more consultation around it and consent. So I think there's a lot of uses that I'm not really comfortable with at the moment, particularly if the government hasn't consulted on how to use it. I hadn't actually seen that news item today, so I'll have to look at it properly afterwards. And Gihan and I know each other, so I can talk to him after as well. But I think really we should be restricting the use more, because we don't know what this data might be used for in terms of other purposes if it's collected and shared with other entities. I think there's quite a lot of well, in the last couple of years, while I support all the COVID contact tracing and all the research to protect us, I do think that has led to some infringement on some of our rights in this context, and a desire to get more data while entities are able to do that. And I just think we should be a little bit more cautious about using these types of data, particularly if someone hasn't been asked for their consent. I think consent is really quite important in this context. I know it's quite difficult to implement as well, but given that we have all this investment in technology, I would have thought we could have more interactive platforms that allowed people to do things and have more control over their data. But yeah, so that's probably my short answer at the moment.
Thanks so much, Andelka. Does anyone have, other questions? I'm looking in the Q&A and nothing in the chat, nothing from people, but I will ask a question more about the last thing you talked about, which is I'd love to hear, but I mean, I can accept if it's a bit early, to hear a little bit more about the work you're doing around the consumer data right in this area.
We've drafted a chapter on this and we'll be presenting at the Consumer Law Roundtable. So I think you could use the consumer data right in this context, but we sort of need a lot more law around it and a lot more of a framework to do that, because it's something that has started to be used in Australia, and we have the beginnings of it in New Zealand, but it's in quite restricted contexts at the moment. And so particularly if we think about the Australian context, it's been in quite specific scenarios. But I think it's something that we could have in the context of these services, at least to just allow people to be able to move their data on. Because one of the things that's, I think, potentially a thing that could go wrong in this space is that a company could change its terms to restrict your access to your genetic data, and that might prevent you from accessing it. And a good comparison is the way that some wearable tech companies have moved to a subscription model. So there was that Aura Ring example where it might be tracking stuff about you, but you might not be able to access it now if you haven't paid for the subscription. And I think that sort of thing could happen in the genetic testing context. And perhaps if we had a more defined consumer data right that was protected legally, that might at least help with that, because there's also been a lot of marketing talk in the context of this industry that says things like, we're giving you your genetic data, we're freeing it up, we're democratizing it, but they're not really doing that. They're selling you a test, and they're doing stuff with the data. So I think the consumer data right could be useful if it meant that it gave people more control in this context, but I'm not entirely confident now if that will actually happen. There's been a lot of things that I would have liked to see in this context over the years that haven't quite panned out. Even the privacy best practices document that came out a couple of years back, none of the companies so far have really adhered to all of that, even the ones that signed on. So I'm not overly optimistic, but I think it could be useful along with other law and enforcement of it. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I've got another question. It does in some ways connect or could connect to your discussion about consumer data right, talking about giving people more control. And there's a reconceptualization or a conceptual problem between law and people's perceptions that persists in this space and in other spaces. And Daniela's has encapsulated this in a good question. I know also we have some IP lawyers in on this seminar, so they'll probably be interested in well. Daniela says, thanks so much for a really interesting presentation. Just wondering what you think of arguments for property rights in data.
To some extent, I am probably in favour of that, but I'm not entirely sure how well it will work currently. I think I've done a little bit of work on this in the past, quite a few years back, around property rights in DNA and human tissue. And I do think that we could have a property right in data in this context, but to some extent, what we might more practically need is that control right, whereby someone, at least, even if they're not profiting, they have some say in how their data is used. Because at the moment, one of the other problems with the way the contracts are normally framed is that they do include quite broad intellectual property rights. And Ancestry DNA specifically had some bad press a few years ago because they had a clause that actually said that they owned your DNA sample. And then they changed that to having an irrevocable worldwide license to use your genetic sample, which is not particularly practically very different. But at the moment, I think, given that in the healthcare context, we haven't had a great deal of support for property rights, in things like extracted tissue and other aspects of development in medical research. I'm kind of supportive of property right, but I'm not quite sure how viable it is. I do really support, though, having a control right and having much more interaction between consumers in this context and companies. Yeah, so I hope that helps.
Thanks, Andelka. I do have one question just following on from Daniela's question and your answer to it. And the question is, in terms of property rights, often are connected to whether or not people should be compensated for use of their data or etc. In this case, use of their DNA in particular and the data attached to it. What do you, in terms of your control right question, do you think it's something that should be able to be, that control right should be something that should be able to be sold by consumers?
I think that could be really problematic. It does connect, though, with something that I have been thinking about in the past, that I think it would be possible for these companies to do profit sharing with their consumers if they do develop a viable diagnostic product or a pharmaceutical product, because they aren't necessarily actually benefiting the consumer that much at the moment anyway, because at the moment, because the sale of the test isn't really that profitable for the company, but the consumer, the nature of the benefit that the consumer actually obtains from particularly having a health test is quite questionable. I think doing things like profit sharing, or at least giving back to certain marginalised communities, would be really helpful, particularly because where there have been pharmaceutical partnerships, they've been very lucrative, and I think it would be pretty dangerous for a control right or a property right that you could actually sell. I think I'm not against the idea completely of having a property right, but if you sold it irrevocably, I think that could cause real problems for you, because I think particularly in the context of pharmaceuticals, there's actually a real potential for targeted marketing of pharmaceutical drugs to people in this context, and I think that could be done in quite a negative and problematic way. So that's really where my concern lies, probably, with that.
Oh, thanks, Angelika. I know we've got 1 minute left. I'm just wondering if we actually have a question from a student. So I'd be keen to see if you've got just a couple of minutes to deal with it. This is from Adriana. Hi, Angelka. Excellent talk. My colleague Danielle and I are doing a project as part of an IT law course. This term, we're focusing on Meta's metaverse and emerging risks for users in the collection and sale of eye tracking biometrics. Do you think this form of data might also be used for health testing or similar secondary uses?
I think so. Yeah, there's a lot of developments in around the eye and research around that. And I've actually co-written a paper with some researchers who are doing diabetic retinopathy. Oh, sorry, I just find that hard to say fast. Retinopathy. Sorry, I just a bit tongue-tied. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff you can actually do with images of the eye. And so I think it's quite likely that those sorts of things could be used for other purposes that might not be obvious right now. And that's something worth thinking about. Yeah, I definitely think it could be used.
Okay, thank you so much, Angelka. Thank you so much for coming along. And thanks to everybody who's come along and given us your attention and your questions. It's such an interesting area, and I'm so excited to get Angelka along for us today. As I say, Angelka has offered to make her slides available there, and so we'll make sure that they're available via the Allens Hub website when we get them up. And I don't know if you can see some comments. That's just a thank you from Gahan.
Oh,
And thanks to everybody
I can see
today.
that.
Yep, for coming along. And I hope you all have a good day, and be careful what you ask for, I think is one of the things from today.
Yes.
Okay,
and
thanks very much. Sorry?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kayleen. And I'm very happy to be contacted, including by students. So, yeah, thanks.
And Andelka's contact details are available on the University of Queensland website. Is that right,
Yeah.
Andelka?
Yeah, and they're also in the slides. So
They're also in the slides. So when we make that available, or you can also contact me, and we can put you in touch with Andelka.
Yeah. I'm very friendly, not scary, even if I talk about scary
She
things.
is very friendly and not scary at all. Okay, thanks everybody.
Okay, bye guys. Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye.